dancers you've been very, very good tonight. I'm very proud of you. Here are our cast, John, Michelle, and Denny, who have won already recording fame.
A song with the same lyrics, a movement cut out of the frame, a look that made the director angry right on set. On American television, those seemingly fleeting moments sparked a wave of controversy across the country. The Ed Sullivan Show was once the most powerful stage, where every artist who appeared was considered worthy by default.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight, live from New York, the Ed Sullivan Show.
But behind the scenes, not everyone survived a fence-breaking attempt. The bans, the secret confrontations, and finally the ending without a goodbye, all created a question that lasted for decades. What really happened to this show? Jim Morrison stood on stage with his hair tousled, his eyes fixed on the camera, when the Doors began to play Light My Fire. He knew he was doing what the producers had asked him to avoid, keeping the line, "Girl, we couldn't get much higher." The line, in the context of 1960s television, was considered to have a stimulant connotation. Before the broadcast, the show's producers asked for a change. The band promised, but Morrison didn't budge. He sang it as it was, blunt and cold. After the performance, no one congratulated him. No one invited him back. The Doors were banned from the Ed Sullivan Show forever.
Now the Doors, here they are with their newest hit record, People Are Strange.
Ed Sullivan needed no words. To him, it was a breach of contract, a disobedience, a tarnishing of the show's image as a national moral standard. The incident quickly became a topic of discussion. A few years later, guitarist Robbie Krieger wrote in his memoir that Morrison may have been singing on reflex. Not intentionally defiant, but the coldness on Morrison's face was enough to convince the producers that he was doing it on purpose. Before Jim Morrison made CBS angry, someone else made American television question the limits of censorship: Elvis Presley.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, yes, that's right, Elvis Presley.
When he first appeared on the show in 1956, Elvis had audiences on the edge of their seats. His hip-swinging, curtsying, and stage presence led many to call him a sex symbol. Conservative groups attacked the show with protest letters, and the press called him a menace to public morals. The third time Elvis appeared on the air, the director ordered the camera to only capture him from the waist up to avoid public opinion. Ed Sullivan initially resisted inviting Elvis, fearing it would affect the show's reputation, but after seeing the viewership spike, he changed his tune. On air, Sullivan called Elvis a nice guy. That response was seen as a compromise strategy: protect the show's brand, keep the audience, but don't let Elvis's image dominate the show's value. In both cases, Elvis and the Doors, Ed Sullivan responded in a way that clearly demonstrated a boundary. If Elvis made him change the way he filmed the show to keep it safe, Morrison hit a hard line: don't lie to the producers. One was reconciled, the other was written off. In terms of media impact, both incidents have become legendary. People revisit the scene of Elvis being turned in half as evidence of American television's control over artists' bodies. People replay Morrison's higher performance over and over again, analyzing every gesture, every look, every tone of voice, as if it contained a calculated rebellion. The images that followed became iconic. Elvis standing still from the waist up, Morrison coldly singing the forbidden lyrics. Both have gone down in television history as moments that were hidden, edited, or pushed out. But they were the moments that woke up a generation and sent the once national standard into a defensive mode. Ed Sullivan didn't yell. He didn't yell at anyone on camera. But what he didn't say was the scariest thing. With the Doors, it was absolute silence after a performance. With Elvis, It was the resigned nod after a million critics. When Ed Sullivan cut Jackie Mason's performance on the evening of October 18, 1964, it seemed like the end of the story. The show was delayed by an unscheduled political speech, shortening the length of the show. Mason was performing when Sullivan raised his hand to signal that the performance needed to end early. In a moment of frustration, Mason raised his hand in protest. Some viewers believed he had given the middle finger, an offensive gesture that was considered unacceptable on American television at the time. The next day, Ed Sullivan announced that Jackie Mason would be permanently banned. His gig was canceled, and his image was pulled from all promotional material. Mason argued that he had only held up 3 fingers, intentionally illustrating the number of times Sullivan had interrupted his performance. The incident became a public dispute, not only between the artist and the show, but also in the media. Mason eventually sued the network for defamation and won. But for the next few years, he largely disappeared from the screen. Jackie Mason wasn't the only person who made Ed Sullivan angry on set. Bo Diddley, the legendary black guitarist, was once asked to perform 16 Tons, a popular song at the time. When he took the stage, Diddley played his own song, Bo Diddley, without informing the director or production team. He said the audience wanted to hear it, and his emotions got the better of him at the last minute. Ed Sullivan saw this as a betrayal. After the show, Bo Diddley was banned from the show. No explanation was given to the public. And since this was the 1950s, with racism still present in the entertainment industry, a black performer who was cut from a nationally recognized show often had little chance of returning. Sullivan's response was no accident. In his eyes, the show was a tightly designed structure, with no room for unscripted behavior. Whether intentional or not, any off-script action was seen as damaging to the show's image and threatening the relationship with its sponsor. The Rolling Stones, one of the most popular British bands, felt this pressure in 1967. They were asked to perform "Let's Spend the Night Together." Nonetheless, the phrase "spend the night together" was deemed inappropriate for a family audience. Sullivan asked them to change the lyrics to "Let's spend some time together." The band agreed, but during the performance, Mick Jagger visibly rolled his eyes at the camera while singing the altered line. It wasn't a rebellion, but a form of silent protest. The gesture quickly spread among fans as a sign of defiance against television censorship. There was no ban as there was with the Doors, but the situation was sensitive enough that the Rolling Stones didn't appear frequently after that. With each elimination, Ed Sullivan cemented his reputation as a standard-bearer for television. But he also made the show seem too rigid and out of touch with the burgeoning creative life out there. Rather than appeasing conservative audiences, the decisions to eliminate artists alienated younger audiences. They no longer saw themselves in the familiar faces on the airwaves. And it's at that point that it's no longer about the artist versus the stage. That's when the bigger powers come into play. Here's how CBS and its sponsors reshaped the entire television ecosystem and ultimately decided the fate of this once legendary show. Underground power. In the early 1970s, CBS began a comprehensive restructuring of its television programming. They called it a network refresh, but the press and observers at the time called it a more specific name, the Rural Purge. The Ed Sullivan Show was on the list of eliminations, along with such familiar names as Green Acres, Lassie, and the Beverly Hillbillies. The motivation is not the drama between the stage and the artist, but the demographic data. Advertisers are shifting their targets. They are no longer interested in middle-aged families in the countryside or the traditional older audience. Instead, they want to reach young urban people with high spending power and who are easily influenced by new trends. At a time when the Sonny and Cher Comedy Hour, the Carol Burnett Show, and more modern shows were starting to dominate, the Ed Sullivan Show looked like a relic. CBS executives didn't want to lose market share to rivals. They needed to refresh their primetime lineup, and the best way to do that was to cut out the once dominant but no longer profitable shows. Under such pressure, Ed Sullivan had little choice. Although he was the face of the show, control belonged to CBS. And CBS, faced with a choice between history and profits, did not hesitate to choose the latter. But this was not the first time Sullivan had to yield to the forces behind the scenes. In 1963, Bob Dylan, then a prominent young voice of the civil rights movement, was invited to perform on the show. He chose Talkin' John Birch Paranoid Blues, a song intended to satirize the far-right John Birch Society. CBS asked Dylan to change the song, fearing lawsuits or backlash from political groups. Dylan refused. He left the show during rehearsals. Ed Sullivan tried to convince the network to keep the show. He believed Dylan was reflecting a social truth and deserved to be on national air. But Sullivan couldn't win the negotiation. Dylan disappeared from the schedule, and CBS avoided the political risk. Dylan's case makes one thing clear: censorship and content direction do not come only from directors or showrunners, but lie deeper in the structure of American television, where sponsors and advertising networks hold the final say. It's the big brands that pay to stay on the airwaves that help shape what kind of content is acceptable. In that environment, anything that could spark controversy, from lyrics to looks to outfits to political symbols, is seen as a risk not worth taking. When these factors combine changing audience tastes, new advertising directions, and fears of losing control over the trend of artist resistance, CBS realized the time had come to close an era. In March 1971, they announced that they were ending production of The Ed Sullivan Show. The official reason given the program no longer fit into their current content strategy. Every show has a curtain call. But this one wasn't the end of a mistake. It was the end of an industry-wide structural change. And while no single scene directly led to the show's demise, the series of events that preceded it sent clear signals audiences weren't what they used to be, and networks weren't willing to play by the same rules. The game cannot be won. Ed Sullivan was more than just a talk show host. For more than 2 decades, he was the first and most important gateway for artists into American popular culture. An invitation to appear on his show could turn an unknown band into an overnight national phenomenon. The careers of Elvis Presley, the Beatles, the Supremes, James Brown, and many others all had one thing in common. They all got their big break on The Ed Sullivan Show. But that iconic role did not protect Ed Sullivan from the wear and tear of time. He was a journalist, not a stage artist. His hosting style was often criticized as dry and expressionless. His dialogue sometimes stuttered, his voice lacking in emotion. Nevertheless, it was this simplicity that made him trustworthy, especially in the context of American television in the 1950s and 60s, which required seriousness, dignity, and no frills. In the eyes of the audience, Sullivan is the embodiment of neutrality. But in reality, he controls every aspect of the show, from the selection of artists to the order of the acts, the length of each segment, the lighting, the filming. No word, gesture, or camera angle escapes his notice. This is what makes him so revered in the production world, and why many artists call him the most difficult person to work with. Sullivan's approach to situations that got out of hand was consistent elimination. When the Doors didn't change their lyrics as requested, they were banned. When Jackie Mason was seen giving the middle finger, he was written off. When Bo Diddley didn't sing his assigned song, there was no second chance. For Sullivan, keeping the show safe and on point was the #1 priority, even if it meant sacrificing a rising talent. By the late 1960s, nonetheless, the principles that had helped him build his television empire were starting to wear on his shoulders. Young audiences were no longer attracted to traditional seriousness. They were looking for something different, for artists with personalities, opinions, and non-scripted personalities. Ed Sullivan couldn't keep up. His adherence to television ethics was no longer compatible with a climate roiled by protest, the civil rights movement, and the rise of the counterculture. His health also began to decline. According to Andrew Solt, the show's producer and archivist, Sullivan was exhausted by the end of the show. The tight shooting schedule, the pressure of censorship, and the changes from CBS's leadership gradually made him lose interest. Although he was still on screen every week, behind the scenes, he was no longer the one who controlled every detail as before. Many tasks began to be delegated to assistants and directors below. Sullivan died in 1974, 3 years after his show officially ended. His passing was not commemorated by a lavish memorial service at CBS, nor was there any new program that would take over or inherit the iconic role he had held for more than 2 decades. There was no attempt to reboot the show in a more modern way. For CBS, the Sullivan era came to a gentle end, as if it were just another completed phase in television history. But for those who worked closely with him, the end of his career meant much more. It was not simply the end of a show, but the end of a television model based on personal prestige, absolute control, and a belief in traditional moral standards. Sullivan was the last example of the kind of host who not only introduced artists, but also decided who was worthy of taking the stage. When he left, American television was entering a new era, one in which power was no longer concentrated in the hands of one individual, but dispersed among collective production, advertising strategies, and an increasingly vocal public. His historic role is undeniable. No other show before him had brought black people to national airwaves as regularly as The Ed Sullivan Show. No one else had dared to include Italians, black people, or female comedians in an era when television was still run on the lines of class and race. He was instrumental in breaking down important barriers in American entertainment, but what he represented quickly became outdated. In less than a decade, power had been transferred from the stage to the audience, and in a new world of television, where viewers decide who gets to appear, Ed Sullivan was no longer the one to call the shots. Legacy never repeats. Over the years, the shocking moments of The Ed Sullivan Show have been remembered as an integral part of American television history. The show didn't disappear because of a specific incident, but ended after more than 2 decades for a simple reason: the world had changed. Young audiences were no longer interested in the traditional variety format. Sponsors had changed their priorities. Networks needed new content that fit their commercial strategy. But the legacy of The Ed Sullivan Show remains. It was where Elvis Presley first stepped onto the national stage. It was where the Beatles exploded onto the scene with over 70 million viewers. It was the first gateway for a series of widely recognized black artists, from James Brown to Marvin Gaye to the Supremes. In an America still grappling with racial discrimination, Ed Sullivan wasn't the most versatile, but he had an eye. He picked the right people at the right time, giving them a unique opportunity to be in front of millions of people. Each invitation from him was a confirmation that the artist was influential enough to break into the mainstream. And in many cases, they were. The show also created an unprecedented model, combining music, comedy, dance, and drama, so that every American family could find something they loved in the same evening. From there, the concept of primetime television was shaped. Modern entertainment shows, from Saturday Night Live to America's Got Talent, have been influenced in some way by the formula pioneered by The Ed Sullivan Show. It's also worth noting that the show wasn't just a star-making event, it also reflected the social landscape of America during a time of upheaval, from the rise of rock culture to the protest movement, to the struggles between artists and media censorship. What happened on stage sometimes lasted only a few minutes, but the reverberations reverberated for years afterward. The story of The Ed Sullivan Show is a testament to how a show can be both a cultural touchstone and a generational barrier. It ended when it was no longer relevant, but it was never forgotten. Today, videos of its performances are still watched by millions of people, not just for nostalgia, but because they are true milestones in the careers of musical and comedy legends. March 28, 1971. The show aired for the last time. No formal goodbye. No emotional finale. But when it comes to 20th century American television, The Ed Sullivan Show comes to mind. A time when the spotlight could truly change lives, and a stage that saw it all. If you feel that what happened on The Ed Sullivan Show reflects a changing era in television, you are not alone. Every seemingly small moment, a glance, a song, an unexpected gesture, marks a dramatic cultural shift. This story belongs not just to those who lived through it, but to anyone who seeks to understand how a stage can influence a generation. If this video resonates with you, please like to show your support. Share with those who might be interested, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on the many stories behind the scenes. Don't hesitate to leave a comment. Your views are an important part of this journey into these powerful historical moments.